Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, October 20th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. President Biden pitches Americans on funding two wars. So President Biden on Thursday night delivered a speech from the Oval Office making his case for the U.S. continuing to fund the proxy war in Ukraine and Israel's onslaught in Gaza. Biden said that he will ask Congress on Friday to authorize more spending for the Ukraine war and for unprecedented military aid for Israel. Media reports say the request will be for about $100 billion and will also include aid for Taiwan, which China will view as highly provocative, the fact that the U.S. is going to roll in money for Taiwan into this big spending bill for these two wars. And it will also include funding for border security. So about $60 billion is expected to be for Ukraine, as the White House wants to pass a spending package on the war that will last through the 2024 election. Israel is set to receive about $10 billion in military aid, and the rest will go toward the border, Taiwan, and potentially other areas in the Asia-Pacific. I saw some reports say that the funding was going to go toward Taiwan and other things in the region. I don't know exactly what that means. So in his speech, President Biden attempted to draw comparisons between Hamas and Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said, quote, "Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. Completely annihilate it," end quote. So the president claimed that it was America's duty to get involved in these foreign wars and that it would keep Americans safe, even though the proxy war in Ukraine is making nuclear war much more likely. And this U.S. support for what Israel's doing in Gaza, and we'll get into in more stories here. I mean, there's a real risk here of the U.S. being dragged into an all-out war with American troops fighting and dying. Some are already being injured because of what's going on. So I'll read this one quote from Biden here, basically how he wrapped up this speech that he gave. He said, quote, "American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep Americans safe. American values are what make us a partner nation you want to work with. To put all that at risk, we walk away from Ukraine. We turn our backs on Israel. It's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine," end quote. So he is all in on backing these two wars. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to send Israel artillery shells that were initially bound for Ukraine. So this story raises the question, can the U.S. really sustain support for these two conflicts? So Axios reported on Thursday that the U.S. is sending Israel tens of thousands of 155 millimeter artillery shells that were designated for Ukraine. So Israeli officials requested the artillery shells as they are preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza, and they're worried about an escalation with Hezbollah and the possibility of a northern front. Earlier this year, the U.S. began dipping into a weapons stockpile that it has in Israel. So the U.S. it has a stockpile of ammunition and I think maybe other kinds of weapons that it keeps in Israel. So the U.S. started dipping into that to arm Ukraine because it had the 155 millimeter artillery shells, which Ukraine has been using an enormous number of. So this report says that Israel has requested that the U.S. replenish that stockpile in case the Israeli military needs to use it on short notice. And the U.S. has agreed to the request and is expected to start sending the shells in the coming weeks. So the U.S. stockpile that's in Israel is controlled by the U.S. military, but under the arrangement, Israel can use the ammunition in a war scenario with U.S. approval and was granted access during the 2006 Lebanon War and the 2014 Gaza War. So Israel has been using more 155 millimeter shells since the October 7th Hamas attack, as it has fired artillery into Gaza and into Lebanon during skirmishes with Hezbollah. So fighting is still going on across the border between Hezbollah and Israel. So it certainly could escalate into a much bigger fight. So Israel's demand for the artillery shells is going to increase significantly if they launch the ground invasion of Gaza. So the transfer of these shells, which were initially bound for Ukraine, like I said, they raised the question about the U.S. military's ability to provide weapons and ammunition for the two wars. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. has so far provided Ukraine with over 2 million 155 millimeter artillery shells. So that's quite a bit that they have already shipped over there. All right. So the next one here, State Department official resigns over Gaza war. So I mentioned this briefly yesterday because I saw it in the update, but I wanted to write up a story about it. So this is an official with the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and he announced his resignation on Wednesday due to President Biden's full-throated support for Israel's onslaught in Gaza that came after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. So this guy's name is Josh Paul, and he said in a statement on his LinkedIn account that he had worked for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs for 11 years. He strongly condemned the Hamas attack on Israel, describing it as a monstrosity of monstrosities, but he said Israel's response will only make things worse. So I know I read some of this quote yesterday, but I think it's a pretty interesting one here. Part of it I want to read. He says, quote, "This administration's response and much of Congress's as well is an impulsive reaction built on confirmation bias, political convenience, intellectual bankruptcy, and bureaucratic inertia. This is to say, it is immensely disappointing and entirely unsurprising," end quote. So he went on to criticize the history of the U.S.'s blind support for Israel. He said, quote, "Decades of the same approach have shown that security for peace leads to neither security nor peace. The fact is, blind support for one side is destructive in the long term to the interests of the people on both sides. I fear we are repeating the same mistakes we have made these past decades, and I decline to be a part of it for longer," end quote. So discussing his time at the State Department, Paul said that he had made moral compromises, but that he had reached his limit. He said, quote, "In my 11 years, I have made more moral compromises than I can recall, each heavily, but each with my promise to myself in mind and intact. I am leaving today because I believe that in our current course with regards to the continued, indeed expanded and expedited provision of lethal arms to Israel, I have reached the end of that bargain," end quote. So again, he works for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and according to the State Department's website, that bureau is the State Department's principal link to the Defense Department and provides policy direction in the areas of international security, security assistance, military operations, defense strategy and plans, and defense trade. Paul said that he was proud of some of the work that he had done there, including on pending administration decisions to transfer lethal weapons to countries that abuse human rights. And he also said that he was happy with his involvement in the policy in Ukraine. So he didn't have any qualms with fueling that war. But it is good to see dissent over this policy in Gaza. And the next one here is an article from HuffPost, and it says that a mutiny is brewing inside the State Department over the policy, the Israel-Palestine policy. So this is very interesting. And basically what it says, I'll read a bit of it. Officials told HuffPost that Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his most senior advisors are overlooking widespread internal frustration. Some department staff say that they feel as if Blinken and his team are uninterested in their own experts' advice as they focus on supporting Israel's expanding operation in Gaza, where the Palestinian militant group Hamas is based. So one source tells them that there's a mutiny brewing and that they are planning to write a dissent cable, which is a thing that gives State Department officials the ability to criticize U.S. policy through this protected internal channel. And it's a way that they can voice their disagreement with leadership and be protected, although, who knows how protected they really are. This is something that started during the Vietnam War, as a lot of people started to dissent against that war. So I think it is good to see that at least, there are some people within the government opposing what Biden is doing here with Gaza. They don't seem to mind, though, that he's looking for another $60 billion for Ukraine after the counteroffensive has completely failed. But that's another story. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. downs a missile fired from Yemen to Israel. So this is a concerning story here. The Pentagon said on Thursday that a U.S. warship in the Red Sea intercepted missiles and drones that were fired by Houthi forces in Yemen. Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder said, quote, "The crew of the guided missile destroyer USS Carney, operating in the northern Red Sea earlier today, shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles and several drones that were launched by Houthi forces in Yemen," end quote. He said there was no casualties and none that they know of to any civilians on the ground. He said it was unclear what the missiles and drones were targeting, but said that they were headed north in the Red Sea, potentially toward targets in Israel. So not saying for sure that they were targeting Israel, but that's what the U.S. is thinking. So the Houthis had warned earlier this month that they could fire missiles if the U.S. directly intervenes in Israel's war on Gaza. The incident is the latest sign that the war in Gaza could escalate into a regional conflict, as U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq have also come under fire, which we'll get into in the next one. So when it comes to the Houthis, the U.S. has been backing a war against them since 2015, a very brutal war in Yemen that was led by the Saudis and the UAE that's killed at least 377,000 people as of the end of 2021. The good news is there's been a ceasefire there since April 2022 between the Saudis and the Houthis that has held relatively well. But from the Houthi perspective, they have been at war with the U.S. If you read their media, they always describe actions of the coalition as U.S. Saudi aggression. So it's something a lot of Americans don't realize, is that while these wars that we're involved in are very far away and don't really affect us, the people that are on the other side of them, it's everything. It affects them very much, and they know who's involved, and that's why when it comes to Gaza and the U.S. backing Israel so much, all the resentment, it's just building the anti-American resentment in the region. And the American troops that are stationed in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere are the ones that could be targeted for this. But what's the big deal about this Yemen thing is that essentially what the U.S. is saying here is that they intercepted missiles that might have been trying to hit Israel. So the U.S. intervening, acting directly to defend Israel from an attack seems to be kind of significant. So the next one here, U.S. bases in Syria targeted with drones. So a U.S. base in Syria came under drone attack on Thursday, causing some minor injuries. So the officials told the AP that the attack targeted the Al-Tanf garrison in southern Syria, and that 2 drones targeted the base. 1 drone was shot down, and the other caused the injuries. So Lebanon's El Mayadin TV also reported a separate drone attack on a U.S. base at the Conoco gas fields, which is located in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province. So the Europe-based Deir ez-Zor 24 media outlet also reported an attack on Conoco, saying that 3 drones targeted the base. So it looked like there is at least 2 attacks on U.S. bases in Syria on Thursday. And the U.S. has about 900 troops in Syria and backs the Kurdish-led SDF. allowing the U.S. to occupy a sizable portion of the eastern part of the country, where most of Syria's oil and gas fields are located. The attacks on U.S. bases in Syria came a day after drones were launched at U.S. bases in Iraq, also causing minor injuries. And on Thursday, it looks like there was more drone attacks on the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq, which houses U.S. troops. So there's a lot happening here, and you never know how the U.S. is going to respond to this. In the past, Biden has launched airstrikes against the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, killing in some cases, a few dozen people in response to rocket attacks that I know in some cases they've killed American contractors or U.S. troops, but I know in one case when Biden responded, there was no injuries. It was just a drone attack, and he bombed and killed people. So that's something Biden's done before. So if he does that now, usually the militias back down. But I think if the U.S. did something like that now, a big airstrike against the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, they might not back down with everything that is going on with Gaza. This is just another way things could really escalate in the region. And it's why, when I'm always talking about Syria, I always say that it's a tripwire. Having those U.S. troops there is always a tripwire for war. And part of the reason the U.S. has stayed is in Syria is because Israel wants them there. When Trump said he was going to leave Syria and then he reversed the decision and said, we're going to stay and keep the oil, he also said that Israel requested that the U.S. stay. Israel does not want Iran, an Iranian ally, controlling all of its territory over there in Syria. All right, so the next one here, Israel's defense minister tells troops to be ready to invade Gaza. So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday told Israeli troops to be ready to invade Gaza as Israeli airstrikes continue to pound the besieged enclave. Gallant told troops near the Gaza border, quote, "Whoever sees Gaza from afar now will see it from the inside, I promise you. It might take a week, a month, 2 months until we destroy them," end quote. Other Israeli officials addressed troops near Gaza and also signaled that an invasion would happen soon. Major General Yaron Finkelman, he's the head of Israel's Southern Command, he said, quote, "Now the maneuver is going to move the fighting to their territory. We are going to beat them in their territory. It's going to be difficult, long, and intense," end quote. So that's the message that we're hearing from these Israeli officials, is that this is going to take a long time. That's what they told Biden while he was in Israel. Some are even saying it could take years. So this is what Biden's looking at supporting and fueling. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told a group of soldiers that they would be victorious. He said, quote, "We are going to win with all our might. All of Israel's behind you, and we are going to heavily strike our enemies so that we can achieve victory," end quote. So the comments from these Israeli leaders came after President Biden visited Israel and gave his support for Israel's plan to invade Gaza, and he's expected to ask Congress for at least $10 billion in new military aid for Israel. So since the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, which killed about 1,400 Israelis, Israeli airstrikes have pounded Gaza relentlessly. They continued on Thursday. They're continuing overnight into Friday. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 3,785 people have been killed in Gaza, including 1,524 children and 1,000 women and 120 elderly people. So really horrific stuff that's going on here. In Gaza. And then the next one, we have the live updates from Middle East Eye. I know there was an airstrike on a Gaza church that was sheltering families. That was reported on Thursday. I'm not sure what Israel's response is to this one. Not sure if they're going to deny it or what, but this was a Greek Orthodox church in Gaza. It's not clear how many people were killed, but again, just really bad. Horrific stuff. And just scrolling through some of the live updates here. The Descent Cable, Lebanese army says journalist killed by Israelis. I haven't really been writing any stories on the escalations in the north between Israel and Lebanon, but it is ongoing. And the Lebanese army is saying that Israeli gunfire killed a journalist in the southern village of Hula in Lebanon on Friday. So I guess that was early in the morning. Dozens of senators urge immediate humanitarian aid for Gaza. So these are probably, Democrat senators, 35 of them. They're saying get more aid to Gaza. I wish they would be saying, how about a ceasefire and we stop supporting this war? So a lot happening. All right, the next one here. The U.S. says that it's ready to fight China and back Ukraine and Israel all at the same time. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it is based on this press conference that was held by Admiral John C. Aquilino. He is the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, so he's the top military commander for the region there. And also Eli Ratner, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. And Ratner is a very serious China hawk. I remember when the transition was happening, when the Biden administration was coming in, the fact that they were including Ratner, initially he was a special advisor to Lloyd Austin, was a sign that they were going to be very hawkish on China, and they have been. And so this press conference was about these, they're accusing China of unsafe, unprofessional, and risky encounters over the South China Sea and the East China Sea. They're saying that there is 180 instances of Chinese and American planes having these encounters in the past, I believe, 2 years. So, remember, this is over waters very close to China. And the fact that there's 180 of these just shows how much the U.S. flies around there. I mean, they do thousands of surveillance flights over the South China Sea, the East China Sea every year. I mean, could you imagine if Chinese spy planes were just constantly flying in, the Gulf, say the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean? I mean, and China has been getting fed up with it, and I think that's why we're seeing more. You see some of the footage, they get close to the American planes. So what these guys are saying is that they were asked at this press conference, can you support Ukraine, Israel, and still be ready to fight China in the region? So Aquilino said, quote, "What I'll tell you is I haven't had one piece of equipment or force structure depart. The U.S. is a global power, and that means we can deliver effects and execute our deterrence responsibilities across the globe. But I don't think any other nation can do this at this time, but the U.S. can. Indo-Pacific Command prepares every day to ensure we execute both of the missions the Secretary gave me. Number 1, to prevent conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And number 2, if mission 1 fails, be prepared to fight and win," end quote. So be prepared to fight and win a war with China, which, who knows what would happen, how that would escalate. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. lifts some sanctions on Venezuela. This is another one from Kyle. So the Joe Biden administration eased some sanctions on Venezuela's energy and gold sectors after President Nicolas Maduro reached an agreement with the opposition to hold elections next year. And Kyle mentions at the same time, the U.S. resumed deporting Venezuelan migrants back to Venezuela. So they're easing some sanctions, and the Treasury Department said, quote, "The United States welcomes the signing of an electoral roadmap agreement between the Unitary Platform and Maduro representatives, consistent with U.S. sanctions policy. In response to these developments, the U.S. Department of Treasury has issued general licenses authorizing transactions involving Venezuela's oil and gas sector and gold sector, as well as removing the ban on secondary trading," end quote. So the Venezuela policy was a total disaster that Trump really ramped up, especially in 2019 when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, even though he was not the president. They backed a very failed coup and sanctioned, Venezuela about as much as they can sanction them. And I know the Biden administration issued some limited license for oil pumping earlier this year, but this seems a little more significant than that. So I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, keep moving in this direction and lifting sanctions. Because usually once they sanction the countries, it's very hard to get them removed. All right, so the last story here, Ukraine's parliament backs ban on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So this article is from Reuters. I just saw this before I started recording here. So the Ukrainian parliament gave its initial approval on Thursday to a law that would ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church after Kiev accused it of collaborating with Russia following last year's invasion. So you have two Orthodox churches in Ukraine. One is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and then I believe the other one is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So, very similar names. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does have historic ties to Russia, as a lot of things in Ukraine do. But after the invasion, the church and the head patriarch, I forget his name, maybe I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, he, denounced the Russian invasion. So did many of the priests, but that wasn't enough for Zelensky. They started arresting priests, seizing some churches, and now this bill this bill that the Ukrainian parliament has approved would actually just outright ban the church. So they still have the other Orthodox Church, but this one, from what I understand, was the bigger one and the older one, and it's just they've really led this crackdown against this church. So where it stands now, deputies had voted to support the bill in its first reading, and it has to be backed in a second reading and approved by Zelensky to go into force. So that's where we're at. So, it's really something, this crackdown on the church. It just doesn't really matter that they denounced the invasion and said that they cut ties with Moscow. They've just been a target of the Zelensky government. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter on ethnic cleansing. Washington, D.C. has always been the hypocrite. One from Ted Snyder. She showcases Russia-China friendship. One from Grant Smith. Spy fail, spies, moles, saboteurs, and collapse of U.S. counterintel. One from William Hartung. Strategic posture review, echoes of Dr. Strangelove. And our spotlight is from Connor O'Keefe over at Mises Institute. No, we cannot fund yet another war. That is everything. That's it for the week. You could always help the show out by sharing it, telling your friends about antiwar.com. If you watch on YouTube, you could subscribe, like, comment, leave reviews, and all that good stuff. Follow us on Twitter. But I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.